Welcome to TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight. The purpose of this podcast is to provide you with a candid conversation about our energy needs, our energy security, and your energy future. Texas oil and natural gas have made our nation the world's energy leader, constantly innovating and investing to fuel the economy, protect the environment, and power the world. This industry is fast-paced, high-tech, and essential to improving modern life. And we're here to talk about it. You're listening to TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight. And thanks for joining us for another episode of TXOGA Talks. I'm Todd Staples with the Texas Oil and Gas Association. Glad to be here with my co-host, Shana Joyce, Vice President of Government Regulatory Affairs for TXOGA.
Thank you for having us. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, you know, we have some amazing things to talk about. Oil and natural gas really is the backbone of the Texas economy. And we've discussed on this program before the 4 Ps.
That's right.
Of oil and gas. I like to use that terminology when talking to chambers of commerce, areas that may not be familiar with oil and gas. But the 4 Ps are pipelines, processing, production, and ports.
You got them out of order, so I was like, oh,
I want to show you
attention.
I knew my material.
You're nimble today.
We've talked a lot about production and different programs. Today, I thought we'd do a little bit deeper dive and go into pipelines.
That's right. Pipelines are so vital for our Texas economy and to move the products that we produce to the processing and ports portion of the P's. That's a lot of P's right there. So yes, I'm excited to kind of do a deeper dive into the 4 P's today.
Well, pipelines are, for our listeners, if you think about your highways, you all drive around a highway each and every day. That's what pipelines are, is a transportation system that meets the needs of the public. And we're very fortunate today because we have an expert, Shana, that's going to join us.
So we're fortunate today to have Vincent DiCosimo, who is the Senior Vice President at Targa Resources, joining us. And he's an expert on pipelines, and I think that he will let us dive in deeper to all of our burning questions about pipelines.
Excellent. It'll be a good program.
Absolutely. And before we dive in, this reminds me that TXOGA has a resource called Pipelines 101, and you can find it on our website at texoga.org/pipelines101. It's a handbook for everyone to use. It really talks about all of the questions that we're going to cover here today and includes really great resources. So we encourage you to check that out on our website.
And Vincent, thanks so much for joining us on today's program.
It's my pleasure to be here. Excited to talk about our industry.
Well, you are a perfect person to have on this program. You're an expert on this topic. I've seen you testify at the Texas Capitol many times. You always do a great job really breaking down all the details surrounding pipelines. I know you travel to Washington frequently. I don't know how you do all that traveling because you're such a good golfer, I'm told.
Oh, yeah. Oh, right.
So, yeah. But besides your golfing prowess, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your background, because you really bring a lot to the table on this topic.
Well, again, thank you very much, because I'm always excited to talk about the industry at large, and then also obviously about specifically when we talk about pipelines, and when you get ready to talk about ports and processing, I'm also ready to talk about those as well, because they're all peas in the same pod. I had to get that in.
More peas.
More
absolutely.
peas? Oh my gosh.
Absolutely.
It's a pea-packed day.
Absolutely. A little about my background. I've been in this industry, and I say this industry, energy industry, for multiple decades. And from the refining side through gathering, processing, marketing, went through all the original nat gas deregulations, Order 436, 500, and 636. So have seen a lot of changes and growth. Certainly a lot of policy changes. You mentioned Washington, and we can delve into that and get more granular on some of the things that are affecting us from a policy standpoint. I've started 5 different companies myself, took one public as an MLP, which was also in the midstream space. So I, again, have a little bit of a background in all things kind of oil and gas.
Well, pipelines is a very important part of our industry. It connects production to all the other end users. And we just don't often, listeners get to really dig into an industry sector like this. Shana, we have a lot of pipelines in Texas, don't we?
That's right. We have almost 480,000 pipelines in Texas. And so Vincent,
Miles of pipelines.
Miles of pipelines,
Yes.
excuse me. Yes, we have let me correct that.
Okay.
We have 480,000 miles of pipelines in Texas. And Vincent, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Targa's pipeline network and then how it works and what role that plays for people who are listening to this podcast. Why should they care about pipelines?
So let me back up just a little bit on something. First of all, you're right. We have almost 480,000 miles of pipelines, intrastate pipelines. And so those are pipelines that run within the state of Texas, not necessarily long-haul pipes that service the Northeast and other parts of the United States as well. So Targa is a player in the intrastate pipelines. We've got about 40,000 miles plus or minus of intrastate pipelines and a number of processing plants that process gas and deliver processed gas to takeaway locations. And then the NGLs that come out of the processed gas, we bring those via pipeline to the Gulf Coast for extraction in our fractionators.
And what's an NGL for our listeners?
Well, that's a great question. NGLs are natural gas liquids. So it's the easiest things to think of like propane. That's one of the NGLs that most people know about because they're using it somewhere in their barbecue or home heating.
Well, and just to be clear, when you talk about gas in this program, we're talking about natural gas. We're not talking about gasoline that we pump into our cars.
That is correct.
And you said it. Why does it have to be processed, though, Vincent? Why don't you explain that to our listeners?
Well, again, natural gas is an organic material, comes out of the ground, and it's not always the same. It's not homogeneous. So to fit a certain spec or a pipeline that's going to take away that particular natural gas and go to a power generator or to an LDC, which ultimately services your home or someone else's home, it has to meet a certain specification, and that requires a processing plant to basically meet that spec.
And an LDC is a local distribution company?
You are correct.
Okay.
Well done.
And that's the gas that goes to your home?
That is the gas that
yes,
services businesses and homes.
Okay.
Correct.
There are a lot of terminology here today.
I know. I feel like I'm in electricity world because we have a lot of like acronyms. So I feel like we're broaching on that.
Well, when people talk about energy, sometimes they do think about electricity, but really energy encompasses electricity. But more than that, everything that powers our automobiles to directly powering plants with natural gas that's provided to that, all of this comes together to make Texas the 8th largest economy in the world. And it's fantastic that we have this level of investment that really brings together the fossil fuels that make modern life possible today. Our energy and electricity needs are often talked about, Vincent, on a regular basis these days. But can you break down for our audience the distinction between the role that pipelines play versus what maybe and how that influences the electricity market?
Well, again, there's a level of complexity here. So let's think about where gas is located and how pipelines play in this market. So most of the generators today that are thermal generators, meaning they run on natural gas, require on a pipeline that connects to them. That pipeline, if we go backward from the generator, is a larger pipeline, and it has met a pipeline. The gas and that natural gas in that pipeline meets that spec a generator needs. If you continue backward, and you go back to that processing plant that I just spoke about that conditioned the gas to get it there, and then you go the other side of the processing plant, again going backward, kind of all the way back to the wellhead. We have a gathering system, much like the arteries. I often use our bodies as sort of the way a pipeline system works. We have small, very small pipes that maybe are 8-inch or down to 4-inch pipelines, and they're small and they gather, and they're gathering at wellheads. They're gathering at sites that produce in the Permian and Eagle Ford and across the state. And they are gathering it, and it comes into that processing plant, and it eventually makes its way through a larger pipeline where the natural gas has been conditioned and gets to a generator who relies on that. And the beauty of that is that generator knows that it's stable. It's a very systematic, he or she can look at what's in the pipeline and know what's coming to them, know what's available 24/7, 365. It's a dependable, reliable source of energy, and it's the same amount of energy in every molecule that they get.
that's an important distinction to make, I think, is that pipelines do not put electricity directly on the grid. That's a fuel source that you're making available to the power generators, just like coal is converted to electricity. Nuclear is another form of power. So I think that's good. And what you described was all intrastate pipelines.
That
I
is
think,
correct.
Right? Yes. And so I think you kind of mentioned this earlier, but you have intrastate, which is within the state, and then interstate, which goes throughout the U.S.
Right. And I'm going to pick up on Todd's earlier comment about roads or highways. So pipelines are really the road system. And we have, if you think about gathering roads or small roads out in rural Texas, for instance, I grew up in the Texas Panhandle in Pampa, and our roads would connect to an interstate, and the interstate is a bigger pipeline in essence. But those interstate pipelines, just as they say, go interstate. And so like an interstate highway system, very much the same. They're the larger pipes that are going from point to point, where the smaller, more gathering systems interstate gather, they take it to a location. It may be a storage site, which is very important too in terms of when we talk about electricity and demand. Storage, very important. And so the gathering systems may take that gas and go into storage locations as well. And we have gathering systems that gather the gas, and then we also have the other side of the plant where it will eventually find its way through smaller pipes to the big pipe.
Well, you mentioned interstate going into other states. So what about the regulatory bodies that you have to work with?
It's a great question.
From if you're going from one state to the next, and you're in a car, you just keep right on going. You don't think anything
You don't
about
have to stop at the lines.
But how about if you're building those
state.
top lines?
I would make a California joke here, but we're on the air. Because if anybody's driven to California on I-10,
nobody picks on California on this program. We just
he can cut this, but if you've driven to California on I-10, they stop you at the border.
Do they really?
They literally do. And you have an inspection of your automobile at the border. I kid you not.
For agricultural products.
It is checkpoint. It's checkpoint Charlie.
Yeah.
It's agricultural product. Yes, the pipeline systems, the interstate pipelines that are the long haul pipes are regulated obviously by a federal agency that's called FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which also regulates power as well as pipelines. And it has other features that it also regulates. It is a totally different type of a regulatory body than the pipeline systems in our state are regulated by. We are regulated by our railroad commission in the state, and there's a lot of different nuances to simply how you would want to regulate a long-haul pipe, just like an interstate highway is.
Is it shorter or longer to work with FERC than it is the Texas Railroad Commission?
Well, I had brown hair when I started working with FERC.
The thing that really I think all Texans should think about is we try to move at the speed of business. Texas really does say, we want you to bring your jobs here, bring your investment here, and getting things done quicker is so important. You mentioned storage earlier, and Shana and I worked on this when Winter Storm Uri hit. There's a lot of conversation about the availability of gas. Vincent, when we started looking at this, we found that Texas has 863 billion cubic feet of natural gas storage capacity, which, by the way, is enough natural gas to power every Texas home for over 2 months.
Yeah.
That's a lot of natural gas. Electricity can't be stored like natural gas can. I mean, batteries are coming on, but the technology
they're not quite there yet, but we have some length of time.
And we're happy about that, right?
Absolutely. We want anything all.
Innovation and technology should make our lives better, not more complex. But when it comes to natural gas storage, Vincent, can you kind of tell us what kind of role that natural gas storage plays and just how important is it for all the different uses that it goes to?
I can. I wanted to back up for 1 second, though, on the regulatory bodies you were asking.
Just don't go back to California.
I'm not.
Okay.
But I did want to say, so I don't want people to think that intrastate pipelines are not regulated. I mean, we are regulated by a number of agencies that also include EPA and federal agencies. So we are regulated by a number of bodies. It's just that, as you said, Texas has a business forward attitude. Texas is looking about how can we make things work for people who work for Texas. And that's big because that provides jobs. And there is a huge differential in the way that we deal with FERC and federal agencies. versus what we're able to get done in Texas. And I didn't want that to necessarily pass us by.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important point to make. So thank you.
So let me hit storages, because storages are regulated. And of course, again, that's under the auspices of multiple agencies. Storages are a key because they are the link that gives us the ability for what we would think about peaks. When you have a peak, whether it's summertime, we now have we're hitting peaks already. I was, astonished at the last weeks that we've had some peak days already, and it's springtime, right? And then we have our peak days in the winter. So storage on natural gas allows us to have natural gas flow to the individual customers it needs to on peak days with a rateable amount that they know, again, they can depend on, so that if in fact that they need more than what would be coming in, say, just by one of their pipelines, and their other pipeline maybe connects to storage, they have opportunities then to actually kind of have a peak demand increase. And that's the beauty of storage. It's almost synthetic battery for gas, if you would. It's a place to put and hold
It's
gas.
your savings account.
It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And having a place to draw from when you need it is important. Contracting for that, because my suspicion is that some of that is spoken for.
Yes, sir.
So, for instance, if you need more gas than you normally do, and Shana, you probably remember how much natural gas is used on average for electrical generation in Texas.
I believe it's between 5 and 6 BCF.
So in a really cold storm, winter weather, you could probably use a lot more than that. So you would then be able to draw on gas from storage.
If you have that contract.
And not only do you contract for the storage, Vincent, but what else is important to contract for?
You've got to have contracts that go for firm transportation. So you actually have to have the airline seat ticket.
You mean pipelines aren't just sitting there waiting for people to call
no.
on any given time? Huh?
No, just like the airplane isn't either. You got to have firm transportation. Okay, you got to have firm storage. Okay, and then not only that, you have to have a firm gas contract, meaning that you have to actually buy the commodity under a condition that says it's going to be available, when available, on call, and that's what we would say is a firm contract. And those are important features in how, whether it's an LDC or whether it's an industrial user or whether it's a generator.
Well, and I'm so glad you pointed that out, because we discussed and used it as an analogy our transportation system, which most transportation highways are paid for by your gas tax, at the pump gas tax. And so every driver that fills up, you're paying a tax every time you do to get on that highway. Pipelines are paid for by private companies who have great risk involved in putting this infrastructure in the ground that benefits all of us. And so that's a distinction there that I think is important to point out here. These are private dollars, private companies that are making investments that are really for the public good, because I want my gas stove to work or my gas furnace to work. And I particularly want my electrical power generation station to be able to have options to get natural gas. But that's all paid for by individuals. Now, as a consumer, we pay for it through our electricity bill or through our natural gas bill. And natural gas prices are pretty low right now, and that's because we have a lot of natural gas in Texas.
That's right.
Yep.
It's
And
abundant.
one feature I would just add on to that is, again, a distinction on interstates versus intrastates. Intrastates, as you said, are privately funded, meaning that you go through your internal capital committee at your company, or you're a private equity funded company. You say, I want to build a pipeline, and I think I can go from point A to B. And you're at risk for any return on that line, as you said. When you build an interstate pipeline from, say, here, the Gulf Coast, to someplace in upstate New York, Connecticut, that pipeline has a set economics you submit to this agency, FERC. And then they decide, should you make X or X plus 1 or X minus 1? And you get a rate of return on that pipeline. So there is a tariff that is also set. And then that pipeline stays in service, and you receive a fixed income, if you would, all the way for as long as the debt is on that pipeline, and that's the return, and it's fixed. You are not at risk as a pipeline developer for whether or not there's half the capacity on the lines used or it's all used, because you get a rate of return set on what the pipeline is going to be built for.
Two distinct different sets of operations and management, no doubt. I have one very complex question for you before we move on. I know Shana want to talk about safety and regulation, and before we go there though, it's real deep. Do pipelines freeze? That was a big topic of conversation.
It was, and
during Winter Storm Uri. So
Yes.
I always think about that.
I cannot tell you the number of times, yes, when I testified, pipelines do not freeze. They do not freeze, and it would be possible, but it would be somewhere in the minus low 60, minus 60 to 260 Fahrenheit before you, depending on what's flowing through those lines, before you would have the ability to actually freeze a pipeline.
That's right.
So the answer is no.
Well, I think sometimes those that may be reporting on different situations, there are things that do freeze. I mean, compressors can freeze. There are separators when water is being separated that can freeze. So these are field operations, but as far as just a pipeline, yeah, they're in good shape.
If anything uses oxygen in its system, then there's a potential because oxygen has inherent water in it.
Sure, that's right. All right.
Well, let's talk a little bit about safety and regulation. So pipelines, we at this table know that they're the safest way to transport products, and they deliver products with about 99% of the time without incident. So we talked a little bit about regulation. So you have your interstate regulators and your intrastate regulators. And then many of us are familiar with calling before you dig. Call before you dig. You call 811. But can you quickly address why that's important when we call before we do any work around our house?
Well, it's incredibly important, and I want to stress that because knowing what is beneath the ground when you're getting ready to put the swing set up for the kids, or you're getting ready to add something in the garden, is extremely important. Because we have, as you already said, a lot of pipelines in this state, and they vary in size. And not only that, but we have water lines and we have your home gas line. So it is very important because it's extremely dangerous if all of a sudden you put a shovel in, or you've got your backhoe, or you're out on your farm and you're getting ready to put some fence posts in and you hit a pipeline. So it is most important to dial 811. Absolutely.
I'm glad you brought that topic up, Shana, because prioritizing safety is something that I've seen this industry is very committed to, particularly the pipeline industry. And I know, Vincent, many companies work with local emergency first responders, and they even have their employees do proactive training at the Texas A&M Engineering Extension Service at the Texas Fire Training School. Is that something that's used broadly?
It is used very broadly. Yeah, very broadly. And I want to speak a little bit on the safety feature as well. So we have put more pipelines in service over the last 5 years, and the incident rate on pipelines is down 23%.
Wow.
So from a safety factor, not only are we putting more pipelines in service, okay, we're actually having fewer incidents, down 23% over the past 5 years. So I think that's something else. The other thing is that just over the last 5 years, the industry itself has spent $1.6 billion on additional instrumentation, pipeline safety, whether it's what we call lollipops to let people know where the pipelines run and out in the field. So a tremendous amount of efforts put on maintaining pipeline safety and maintaining to the public knowledge about where pipelines are running.
That's wonderful. And so I kind of want to move on to maybe some environmental aspects of that. So we already discussed that pipelines are the best way to move our products that we produce, and we're taking trucks off the road, right? And so I think, in fact, I think it's estimated that one 20-inch pipeline running 50 miles can replace a 1,650 tanker trucks. And so why don't you think we talk about the safety aspect of removing that congestion, removing those trucks off the road, getting them on the road maybe for something different, right? Because they're an important part of our what we use every day. But why don't you think we talk about that more?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that the trucking industry is also very vital to our industry. We're integrated in the sense that we rely on takeaway from trucks for water at the production site. We rely on distributable LPG via trucks that take it from a big tank to a little tank, let's say, particularly if you're a propane consumer today. And I think that's important. And I think it's also important to note that there are simply some commodities that can't be shipped via truck. Things that come off our container ships in Port Houston, for instance, go out by container trucks. Overall, I think we're moving anything and more things that we can via pipeline. Certainly, as we get away from the trucking side of the industry, we're all concerned about carbon intensity, right? And that's a nice way to say, cleaner air. And so we're just concerned. We all live in our own communities, right? We breathe. There's no segmentation around the DiCosimo house in Houston, Texas versus my neighbors, right? So I'm breathing the same air. So we're all interested in cleaner air. So anything we can put on pipeline, which has a much, much lower carbon footprint, better carbon intensity level, lower carbon intensity level, we're taking off of trucks. So I do think we're seeing more things move that way when it's possible. But we're an integrated industry when you look at it.
Absolutely.
When we talk about, Vincent, the changes that are being undertaken in society today, how does that relate to the pipeline industry in terms of new advancements and technological breakthroughs? What are some of the things that pipeline companies look at to be smarter and faster today than as compared to 10, 20 years ago?
There are so many things. We'd have to do another session. There are. From our ability to use all kinds of today's cellular technology, satellite imaging, satellite technology. When we look at our ability to know, for instance, back on our carbon footprints today, how much better we are today in capturing the carbon that might be emitted by a pipeline valve or at a wellhead site, we're so much further ahead today. We have our protection for our employees, which is number one. At Targa, we begin almost every meeting with a safety moment, which we think is important to build that safety culture. Well, there are a number of enhancements for the individual employee from a safety standpoint too. In our plants and along our pipeline, we have all kinds of additional technology that has been put forth over just even some of it in the last few years, last 2 or 3 years, that afford us a much better understanding of where there's a safety risk. And then our ability with computerization and AI to look at where we've had a safety moment and come back and say, okay, let's do a review of that safety incident. And how can we not have that happen again? And we don't have to go out now and replicate that. We can do it with AI on a laptop and do a tabletop drill. So there are so many upgrades that we've done, which is why you see that safety factor down 23% in incident rate with more miles of pipeline being built.
And this remote monitoring, leak detection, these are all very real techniques. And, we talked a little bit about agriculture just briefly at the California checkpoints, but there's an ag term in pipelines that we want to talk about too. There's a pig, but wait a minute. There's also a smart pig.
There is a smart pig.
Tell us about how our pigs relate. That's another P here today.
Now I know you may have an affinity for A&M, but
I do.
I know. So we're going to say today the smart pig went to A&M.
Okay, very good. I like it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And those are ways that we actually check the internal corrosiveness of a pipeline. We can check what we call integrity of the pipeline. What does it look like? Which again, in the quote old days, you kind of waited for a leak and then went out and knew where it was. Today, we can project the wall of a pipeline. We can see, where we might have potential damage. We can see what the welds on a pipeline look like. We can continue to see how just what the overall internal part of the pipeline. And again, I kind of look at it a lot like today, how much better knowledge we have of like, what do your arteries look like, right? Is there plaque buildup? And we kind of do the same thing today with a smart pig. And all of that data comes in and it gives us a chance to also model that going forward where we don't have to almost second guess what does the future look like on that line. We know that in some period we need to take part of it out of service, repair it, do something different. Much better, the mega data that we get coming out of it is terrific.
And consumers benefit when all of these, consumers are the real winners in all of this. It's great news. Now, I know protecting our environment is important, but also another topic that has an E. We're being alliterative today.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about endangered species. I know that a lot of our operators are always watching what is going on with the Fish and Wildlife Services. So can you talk a little bit about routing with endangered species? But can you also talk about sometimes those endangered species lives near waterways. So that's a twofold question. Talk a little bit about endangered species and then waterways.
I'm going to do that, and I'm going to talk about one other little side note. See, you shouldn't have invited me today.
No, this is great. This is exactly
I want to
what
back
we
up a
want.
second because an important bill, which sort of had a little bit of this in it, but really dealt with the landowners' rights, and that was HB 2730 that was passed, and that was the landowners' rights bill. Now, why is that important, and how does that segue to the other parts? Well, it's because we start all things in our business with the landowner. Whoever, and it may be the state, it might be a BLM property, or it might be an individual. And when we start looking at routing, we say, let's go meet with the landowner. We've projected a route, and in our projection for that route, we're going to cross this creek, that hill, this pasture land, and we want to know who owns it, and we get all the ownership on it, and then we one by one walk down that path and meet with every landowner. And some of those landowners happen to be, a special species of a frog. Occasionally it's some special bird. And so we try to make sure if that's a habitat that either we route around it or we understand the implications to it. And we have to remember that pipelines, the interruption for that species or that landowner is temporary in many respects because the pipeline is buried. It's not, people I think sometimes have seen what the old Alaskan pipeline looked like, and it was elevated because tundra. But the pipelines in Texas are buried. They're beneath the ground, which is why you dial 811, folks. Okay, but the landowner doesn't see it after we're through, right? And the same thing with species. So we're very cognitive to work with fish and wildlife and say, what are the implications in an area that we go through? If it's a state park, we might want to make sure, what are we doing? We stay away from, obviously, schools and hospitals. But we do that in the very early stages of routing and make sure that all the parties have an opportunity, even those species that are potentially endangered, that can't speak for themselves, that we make sure that we are truly, letting them play a part by having somebody from the agencies that oversee them be a part of the discussion.
I'm glad you worked in the importance of landowners in this process because here's the thing. Landowners, the right to own and use private property is what has made Texas the great state that it is today. The right to develop your minerals, the right to raise your cattle or cotton or your pine trees in East Texas or poultry, or we could go up and down the list. But Shana mentioned the Handbook 101 earlier in the program. You're a big author and mover and shaker in making that happen. That's a great resource. And so I encourage our listeners
Well, I was going to say it includes the Landowner Bill of Rights.
It does.
So I think that's a really handy resource for folks to look at. So that's another reason to go check that resource out.
We need highways, we need pipelines, we need broadband connection, right? We need electricity lines. And they have to go somewhere. And so we want a process that's fair, and we want landowners to be protected in this process. As a landowner myself, that's a very, very important topic. Look, we may have to get some extra airtime for this, Vincent. You're a wealth of information. But speaking of wealth, I want to get into another topic real quickly as we move through here and wrap up today's program. Exports and the role of pipelines. America used to be a net energy importer. Now we're a net energy exporter. Talk to us a little bit about the role that pipelines play.
I'm glad you asked that. So you mentioned very early on, I'm in Washington a lot. I was just there twice in the last 3.5 weeks for a variety of issues. But every time I met with somebody, we talked about this pause on LNG. So pipelines, again, are the connectivity, right? We are the sort of the carotid artery, if you will, of America, just in general. If you produce, but you can't extract it and get to a point of either a processing plant, and even oil relies on producing the gas, that's the natural gas associated with it, right? So pipelines are the ability to carry it, move it to, as we talked about, a storage, or move it to an export location. And by export, I want to be clear. When I use the word export, it's not always waterborne. It may also mean export as in a long-haul pipeline going to New York or something, leaving the state. Now, on natural gas, most of our excess natural gas today is going out via these waterborne. And it is so important that we continue to have pipelines being built because we have congestion in these pipelines right now. And many of the pipelines, frankly, are at capacity. And again, linking back to the fact these pipelines are not funded by the federal government. These are companies and individuals who make a decision to build. And they do that based on projections of getting that gas moved from point A to B. Well, B right now would be the LNG export facilities. And if we have a federal pause on LNG exports, meaning that 3 to 5 years from now, there will not be a location to take this gas to, we're going to continue to see that impact the state of Texas. It's actually going to impact consumers because we're going to continue to not produce gas, which right now has kept prices lower in this state. And so we will see prices moving higher, not just in Texas, across the U.S., solely because we refuse to produce what we have that's given us energy security. And the pipeline connectivity is vital. So for us to build a pipeline, we need to know that there's going to be a receiver. I think in baseball, a lot of times you got a pitcher and a receiver. So if the pitcher is E&P and the Gulf of Mexico, wherever it is, an export terminal is the catcher, okay, we're that point of delivery from point A to B, right? And if we don't have a catcher that we know is going to be built 3 years or 5 years or 6 years from now, well, we don't want to build a pipeline. So we're continuing to add congestion in our own markets today, and we potentially can harm E&P tomorrow.
We have a big system. We have more natural gas than we can possibly use. We've discussed that on previous programs. Not only is LNG a big factor, you mentioned we're exporting to other states. We're also, Mexico is a big importer of natural gas, and it's good that we have this resources because that means we're exporting product and we're bringing back revenues that creates jobs, builds infrastructure, and all Texans certainly benefit.
So I think before we conclude with you today, because we will have Dr. Foreman on our show today, but let's talk a little bit about jobs and economic impact, because that's an important thing that we talk a lot about on this. Can you talk a little bit about some examples of careers in the pipeline industry?
I just think careers in the energy industry at large right now are tremendous, and I'll bring that home to the pipeline industry. But when I talk to, I'll say, young people, recent graduates or folks who are thinking about careers, I try to stress that this is a 30, 40, 50-year career path for you. These are not going away. These are fabulous jobs. They're that you can stay in a role. If you want to be a pipeline welder for the next 30, 40 years, so be it. Or you can pick a career path where you know you can move up through an organization working for a pipeline company as well. But there are service industries that service pipelines. There's construction for pipelines. As we talked about, there's safety. There's the people who integrate the pipelines today in terms of our ability for leak detection and all of the other things. It's a tremendous opportunity.
You mentioned a career out of it. In our den at home, at our house, we have a plaque to my father-in-law, Frank Wendell, for 41 plus years of service to Lone Star Gas.
Yes.
It's amazing
Awesome.
what it can do for families.
Well, I also think too, when you think about these kind of more traditional jobs like a welder, you also talked about AI and using technology. And so I think that's another place that is booming and not just the oil and gas industry, but in all industries, and how we utilize this technology coming forth.
Absolutely. And it's going to be very important as we integrate that to learn how we can do that in mobile environments too, or in harsh environments. So those are all going to be careers that are honestly are going to be really cross-generational, and they're also going to be across commodities, so to speak. So what might work for Amazon may work for us, and vice versa too with AI.
And if you're looking for a career in this industry, Shana has some information for you.
Yes, we urge you to visit TXOGA's Career Center. It's careers.texoga.org, and you may be able to find one of these great, highly skilled and highly paying jobs.
And speaking of that, the Texas Pipeline Association, who you were past year and we work with frequently, commissioned a study from Texas Tech University analyzing the economic impact of the Texas pipeline industry. And their most recent study says that from 2020 to 2060, the pipeline industry will generate almost $1.5 trillion in economic output and over $900 billion in additional gross state product. That's going to support over 490,000 jobs over the next 40 years. So there's some wonderful things here. And so as we bring this to a close here, Vincent, we've talked about a lot of different topics within this sector of the industry. And just in closing, what are some things that you'd want the listeners today to know about the pipeline industry as we wrap up?
Well, again, it's the safest transportation mode that we have today. Again, back to trucks. When we put a pipeline in where we have trucks that were carrying the same commodity, we take about 1,650 trucks off a highway. So that lowers congestion, chances of wrecks. Pipelines today, again, continue to have a stellar safety record. So when you see someone who's getting ready to build a pipeline or think about a pipeline, understand that serves not only the needs that you may have as a consumer, but it serves really the state and the regional area and helps with continuing to create jobs, because that's one of the things that we're all about, is something that is going to create jobs, and jobs that are lasting jobs, as we just talked about.
Shana, for those of us that have to drive in Austin, thinking about those how many trucks off of
1,650 trucks.
That's a lot of
on a
trucks.
20-inch pipeline.
From a 20-inch pipeline that's how long?
50 miles long.
50 miles long. That's a lot of trucks off the road. That gives us more maneuverability options, which is very important.
I don't know about that in Austin, but we'll see. Well, I think we want to thank Vincent so much for being here today. I think you're a wonderful spokesperson for pipelines and for our energy industry as a whole. So we thank you so much for being here.
I'm very appreciative. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm always excited to talk about what industry we're in.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. And next up is Foreman's 4.
Yes, so we'll take a short break and we'll be right back. This episode of TXOGA Talks is brought to you by Devon Energy, Repsol, and Targa Resources. Welcome back to TXOGA Talks. Now we have Dr. Dean Foreman with us to give us the Foreman's 4.
And Dr. Foreman, I'd like to start out today about giving us an energy overview so far for 2024. We're into the year. Tell us the big landscape.
Absolutely. And following up on the pipelines you just talked about, none of this happens without it. Production numbers from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, we're looking at 5.5 million barrels per day by official data of crude oil production, 32.3 billion cubic feet per day of marketed natural gas production, and on top of that, another 3.6 million barrels per day of natural gas liquids. So as of February, the latest official data, they're killing it. And by our projections, which we put forward in the monthly energy economics review for TXOGA, we are up as of March and April to 5.7 million barrels per day, holding steady, same natural gas, 32.7 billion cubic feet per day, and also holding steady at 3.6 million barrels per day of NGLs. So this is incredibly strong, at or near record levels, despite less drilling. We're just continuing to plot forward.
And we're talking about Texas numbers, right? These are not the national numbers.
That's just Texas.
This is just Texas all by itself.
That's incredible.
That's good. Texas is doing a lot to make this nation energy dominant and energy secure. And you mentioned about drilling and getting more with less rigs. So let's talk about on your next point about the Permian drilling productivity. Let's get into that a little bit.
So in the latest data, and this is really remarkable because it's through March and April in EIA's estimates, but if you take a rig, you run it for a month, and you look at the total oil and gas on an energy equivalent basis that you get out of it, 23.3% year-on-year productivity gains. This is a lot more than just longer laterals. This is fundamental process and innovation in the technology, just doing it better, getting more. There's also some tailwind from drilled but uncompleted wells, but this is really strong productivity. By any measure, it's the highest since 2021, which was anomalous because it was, the base year then was the pandemic. So this is historically strong productivity gains.
Over 20% productivity gain is a big number when you consider the volumes that you're talking about, and that's what makes Texas the world's leader when it comes to energy. The third point is about the Permian Basin. So just how important is the Permian in regard to all of these numbers that you've been discussing today?
Well, what's really interesting when we take it apart, and again, combine oil and gas, and you get a lot of associated gas with oil production in the Permian Basin, it's by far in a way, the most dominant basin. So the growth, it's accounted for 2/3 of the growth nationwide for total oil and gas combined. And in EIA's assessment, the only other production region that's grown year on year as of April is the Niobrara. So that's Colorado and surrounding states, but no other area. So this means the Permian Basin is really killing it.
Well, the Permian Basin is the epicenter of production. That's staggering, Shana, to think about. 2/3 of the nation's growth comes from the Lone Star State there.
I think that kind of ties in a little bit with the Permian Basin Reliability Plan. I'm kind of transitioning to electricity, but that's why we need those lines, and that's why that plan is so important, because we're seeing here the numbers are proof in the pudding, right?
You are, and you mentioned electricity, which brings us to the fourth point on Foreman's 4 today: natural gas. Let's talk about natural gas for just a moment.
Well, again, none of it happens without the pipelines that you were discussing with Vince, but we're talking seriously, as of May 3rd, more than 30% in terms of gas storage above the top of the 5-year range. So this is historically strong nationwide storage levels. Here in Texas, the latest data, 687 billion cubic feet per day as of February. So again, that's up more than a quarter compared with where it's historically been 2 years ago. That's really amazing. And it's because we've got this ample storage and historically low prices, the lowest winter prices ever on record for the United States here, under $2 per million BTU through the winter. That has incentivized more natural gas plant additions. And for the first time in ERCOT's latest monthly reporting, we see 500 megawatts of natural gas that are getting added. So it can be a combination of the incentives that you've talked about, but it's also the fact that they've got confidence in the fuel, the fact that the production's there, the low prices, and the storage availability.
To know that more electrical generation is coming about because of the abundance of natural gas. Dr. Foreman, that's the Foreman's 4. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm really glad we had a very robust conversation about one of those P's. We had a lot of P's in today's episode, so I hope you picked up on all of them. But I think what we're confirming today is that pipelines are a safe, environmentally friendly way to transport the products that then create the additional products that we use every day.
Texas continues to be a global energy leader because of the oil and natural gas that's produced here, and because of the pipelines, as we discussed, that makes it all connect. We've discussed production. We've discussed pipelines. We've got 2 more P's. So if you're interested in ports and you're interested in how oil and natural gas really does make up 96% of the products that we use every day, we hope that you'll stay tuned. Shana, thank you for co-hosting with me today. We appreciate Dr. Foreman being here. We certainly thank Vincent DiCosimo with Targa Resources for explaining how it was really a Pipeline 101 conversation today, and went deeper. So we have much to talk about. This has been TXOGA Talks, where energy meets insight.
The views expressed on this podcast are not intended and should not be construed to be the views of any particular TXOGA member or company. The purpose of this podcast is to engage in candid conversations about energy needs, energy security, and the future of energy.